China has just delivered the largest AI model ever released, as usual with open weights. Meanwhile, here in America, we just seem to make a giant misstep over the will they won't they release of Fable. So, is this it? Does China now rule AI? I think it's actually way more complicated than that. Let's face it, up to now, the way that AI has typically been discussed is this big two-player game between the US and China. It's a bit like the space race, but with Beijing standing in for Moscow. And two-player games are predictable and easy to understand. Each side watches the other, each side counters the other. You can more or less see where it's heading. But there's actually a third player at this table. I suppose you could call them everybody else. Up to this point, they've been largely sitting on the sidelines, buying whatever the two big players are selling. But in the last 5 weeks, I think they've learned something they can't unlearn, that their access can be cut off. If they've got any sense at all, then they'll be making plans accordingly. So, what could those plans be? Well, I think to understand that, you have to think a bit more about the precedent that has just been set. As you probably know, the US Commerce Department ordered Anthropic to deny access to Claude Fable, which is probably still the most capable AI model in the world, to every foreign national on Earth. Now, Anthropic had no way of checking nationality in real time, so they did the only thing they could. They turned it off for everyone. That sort of 18 days of darkness that some of us were talking about. So why exactly did this happen? Honestly, nobody outside the room really knows. I certainly wouldn't take it as read that the precise reasons offered by the Department of Commerce or Anthropic are exactly the truth. But the signal was seen differently inside the US and outside the US. For many of us inside the US, this was either the US government doing its duty to keep us safe, the US government sending a warning to a company it didn't like, or possibly a little bit of both. But outside the US, this was looked at as a really worrying precedent being set about export controls. We've had export controls applied to chips already, but a model, that's new. There was no warning either, and very little explanation. And of course, this restriction wasn't just for adversaries. The order applied to countries like the UK, Canada, and Japan, because it applied to everyone. These are countries with intelligence sharing agreements and mutual defense treaties with Washington. Of course, Fable did come back online at the start of July, but that precedent didn't go anywhere. And now, at the World AI Conference in Shanghai, Moonshot released Kimi K3, 2.8 trillion parameters. This is by a mile the largest open weight model ever released, benchmarked third in the world behind only Fable 5 and GPT 5.6. So we've now got a fast, good, and relatively cheap alternative to American AI that's made in China. Here in the US, we might see this as Chinese labs stealing our American models in an attempt to dilute their value. But how would governments and organizations outside the US and China see this? If I were them, I'd look at it this way. As things stand, all economies' growth is getting more closely tied to extensive use of frontier models. And for frontier models, there are basically two choices today. Choice one is US-centric. US AI comes with a kill switch that has already been used on its allies. This is against a backdrop of arbitrary increases in tariffs, threats over Greenland, and frankly, questions over whether American security guarantees still hold. So basically, access to a US frontier model today is no guarantee of access tomorrow. Choice two is China-centric. Sure, these are open weight models, but just because you have full access to Kimi K3 today, it's no guarantee that you'll have access to whatever tomorrow's frontier model is. And of course, you're throwing your lot in with a government that has a history of arbitrary restrictions on trade and of stealing IP. So it's not a great place to be in. The Western playbook of the last 80 years, which is basically aligned tightly with the US and everything else sorts itself out, may no longer be a good call. The governments are taking notice. Just before the Fable shutdown, the EU published its tech sovereignty package. It's a draft regulation treating cloud and AI as critical infrastructure and steering public contracts towards European providers. Meanwhile, in Canada, they launched a national AI strategy with $2 billion behind it, explicitly aimed at reducing dependence on US technology. When Mark Carney was asked whether that might irritate Washington, he said, "This is a strategy that any sentient country is taking." As Andy Burnham has formed his cabinet for the new government in the UK, he's appointed a cabinet-level AI minister, the first of its kind in Europe. I think these countries are worried, and I think they should be. As a French presidential candidate recently pointed out, a nation dependent on others for technology can be unplugged overnight. It's going to take a while for this everybody else group to fully get their act together, but once they do, there are really only three possible options. The first option is centered around diversification. Bit of American, bit of Chinese, some downloaded weights as insurance. This is broadly what the Gulf states are doing, spreading billions across every lab and every chip maker that will take their money. This does buy some optionality, but it doesn't buy independence. Every one of those paths still ends up at a decision made in Washington or Beijing, so the party's still risking caught up in a massive trade war or geopolitical skirmish. The second option is centered on new business structures. Here's the basic idea. These countries entice American labs to set up shop properly inside their borders. And I don't mean sales office, I mean separate legal entities established under local rules, sharing the model with the parent company. Imagine an Anthropic UK that holds the weights in Britain and operates under British law. If Washington flips the kill switch, Anthropic UK keeps running and keeps developing, essentially a licensed fork of the frontier. Now, this might sound a bit far-fetched, but the United States has already written this playbook. It's exactly what Washington demanded of TikTok: restructure locally under our rules or lose the market. Middle powers can make the same offer in reverse, and the labs might actually welcome it because a model with a jurisdictional guarantee is a better product than a model with a kill switch attached. Could the US government retaliate against a company for doing this? Yeah. But punishing an American lab for guaranteeing allies access would pretty much make the allies point for them. The third option is where I think we'll ultimately end up. Some form of alliance between many countries to build and govern AI. Probably the EU plus the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Maybe Japan and South Korea might join the party too. If you took all of those countries together, that's about a third of the global economy and the most advanced chip supply chain outside the US. And the gap has opened up for exactly this. America's offer to the world is frontier capability, democratic norms, and the rule of law, but with a kill switch attached. China's offer is open weights, real capability, and aggressive pricing, but under an authoritarian system. It's hard for either side to fix its weakness because the weakness is kind of baked into what each of them is. So I think this leaves room for a third offer. How about frontier class AI built on democratic norms and transparent ethical frameworks with genuinely open weights and access guaranteed as a utility rather than granted as a favor? Could they pull this off? Europe's share of its own cloud market is only about 15%, and every honest analysis puts real AI autonomy 5 or more years away. But I do think it's possible, particularly if this has stopped being a return on investment question and turned into a national security one. Nations fund national security rather differently. They start stepping away from can we afford this and begin to think can we afford not to do this. One other reason they might be able to do this comes from the open weights question. Open weights give you the opportunity to do local deployment on local compute, and this can take a large bite out of the data center problem. We're increasingly grumpy about AI data centers in the US, but over in Europe, objecting to data centers is fast becoming a national obsession. Now, if you're American, maybe this feels like somebody else's problem. After all, we have the models, so we, or at least our government, sets the rules. But right now, we have hundreds of billions being poured into American AI through government investment, venture capital, and upcoming IPOs. The future value being assigned to all of this is predicated on an assumption that much of the world will run on American models. Will it? If the rest of the world concludes that they cannot risk running on an American model, they'll stop building on those models, and valuations will plummet. Anyone who tells you that they know exactly where this is going is either delusional or lying. We're moving from a vaguely predictable two-player game to a really complicated multiplayer one. And who will dominate that game is about way more than who has the best frontier model.